I'd like to begin by introducing our first speaker, Todd Mitchell. Todd has spent his career in energy, first in natural gas exploration and geophysics, and most recently the founder of 27 Ventures, a clean energy investment fund. 27 Ventures investment portfolio includes companies in solar PV development, building energy management, building power, lighting and control, hot water monitoring and controls, energy storage, and synthetic biology. And interviewing Todd today will be Loren Steffy, contributor for the Houston Chronicle. He formerly served a business columnist for the Houston Chronicle and has appeared on CNBC, Fox Business, BBC, and PBS, and now after today he can put on the list he's appeared at TAMEST. He is the author of the George P. Mitchell, Fracking, Sustainability, and Unorthodox Quest to Save the Planet. Would Mr. Mitchell and Mr. Steffy please come forward? Thank you.
Thank you. We can see our faces anyway. All right. Just a disclaimer before we start. I actually live in the hill country, and you may have heard that the cedar has been particularly brutal this year. So even though I'm up here, I'm hoping that it's clearing out, but I may have to use my water glass here from time to time. So, but Todd, thanks for joining me today. And I guess what I'd like to start out with is talking about a little bit about the history of fracking. What we're here to talk about today is research to commercialization, and fracking is a wonderful example of that, but it's also kind of an unusual example of that. So maybe start out talking a little bit about what your father was trying to do, why he became so focused on fracking in the first place.
Yep. All right, well, first of all, thank you for inviting us to come talk about this. I got to know Loren when he was working with our family and other people in our family business organization to write this book, and it was a pleasure to be involved, and really happy with the way he's portrayed this whole history. So, I think the simple story was that the Boonesville gas field up in basically, which is in the same basin as the Barnett Shale, had been Mitchell Energy's breadbasket since before Mitchell Energy was a company, since back in the late 1950s and early 1960s. And that was a more traditional sandstone reservoir, very complex geology, but over the years had been essentially the company's sweet spot. And everyone knew that resource was declining. And I think there were some studies which you document in your book that sort of lit the spark in my father's mind that the natural gas that was essentially absorbed or trapped within the shales, if you just did the math on the volume of it, it was just a staggering amount of gas. And I can only say, having grown up with my father and seen him in so many different situations, that once those ideas get into his head, it's all over. He would not. He would not take no for an answer. He wouldn't believe that there couldn't be a way of extracting that gas, no matter what the history had been of attempting these things. So it was really kind of born of necessity of the company's sort of potential decline based on the conventional approach, and just simply call to action with his team to figure out how to get the gas out of the ground.
And one of the things that I ran into in doing the book is the shorthand for George Mitchell is that he was the father of fracking. And one of the things that everybody I talked to, worked with him, worked at the company, everybody in the family was very emphatic about the fact that is not true.
No, not at all.
Talk a little bit about that.
Well, I mean, I'm not expert on the entire history of fracking, but as a number of pieces have been written about it, it was. I think there were examples sort of post-Civil War in which people were dropping dynamite down into boreholes in Pennsylvania After World War II, there was a lot of experimentation with it. There were nuclear detonations in New Mexico to try to fracture, and by the 1970s, during the so-called tight gas incentive era, not just Mitchell Energy, but dozens and dozens of companies were using hydraulic fracturings. I think the innovation, I mean, simply put, was applying hydraulic fracturing to shales, number one, and to do so in a massive way in terms of the pressure and the amount of fluid, and then thirdly, the so-called slick water fracs. Those were the innovations that took sort of about a decade probably to sort of unravel.
And I think what's interesting about that is that research, which is the discoveries that really made it all work economically, that really made it commercially viable, that was work that was really done at the company. That was not really academic studies or anything. At that point, it had really moved into sort of trial and error in the Barnett.
Yeah, it was definitely just sort of incremental experimentation, project by project, and I think the culture that was created within the company was one that allowed for those sort of experiments to happen, which is not necessarily, the oil and gas industry is innovative and innovates within companies and throughout companies, but I think occasionally you have a culture that really sort of has a goal in mind, and that you're going to fail quite a lot along the way. And as long as you kind of have that long-term view that this is the goal and we have to keep trying, I think that's what was kind of unique about Mitchell Energy during those days.
Well, and of course you were involved. You were a director at the time, so you saw some of this happening firsthand. But I don't think it's a stretch to say that part of the success was because Mitchell Energy was basically an extension of your father's personality in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Unfortunately for a lot of investors who thought they could be activists, he controlled something like 55% of the company at the point that it was a publicly traded company. And within our family, it was a huge battle, not a battle, but it was pleading with them during a time where we kind of came to understand that dominant single ownership was actually not beneficial to the stock price and to the future of the company, and we kind of had to talk them down from 55% to 47% or something like that. But that was a rough one. But yeah, it basically allowed him to sort of stick with that vision that we're going to find a way to make the Barnett Shale a viable economic prospect.
Well, it's interesting because at least during part of that time, Chevron had bought a bunch of properties in the same area. They were pursuing much of the same idea in a lot of ways, but they gave up. They said, we've spent enough on this. We can't justify continuing to spend that money. And in fact, I believe Mitchell Energy hired a few key people from Chevron during that time, which actually furthered the innovation on your side of things.
Well, I mean, again, that goes to what can happen if you have a visionary, I guess, driving the story. And I think even looking back on it, I think when you were writing your book, it kind of sent me back to some of the old company reports. As late as the late 1990s, I think what people think about in terms of the shale boom, so to speak, is sort of this combination of hydraulic fracturing, but also the horizontal drilling. What is actually worth noting is during from the mid to the late 1990s, still dominantly the wells were vertical wells. Mm-hmm. And I would argue that had it not been for some really beneficial gas contracts that Mitchell Energy had, those would not have been economic in a typical economic environment at the time. But those long-term gas contracts allowed them to keep plugging away at these vertical wells. And I think by the time Mitchell Energy merged in with Devon Energy, I can't imagine there were more than 100 or 200 horizontal wells in existence, and of course now there are tens of thousands.
Yeah, that was really the marrying of that technology that made it all work and allowed other companies to then capitalize on it as well.
Yep.
It's interesting because I think your father holds a unique position in that he's one of the few people who essentially bet big on natural gas and didn't get run over by it. One of the things that I found interesting was that George Mitchell said in about 1972, when the company went public, He said, Wall Street doesn't understand us because they think we're an oil company, and we're not. We're a natural gas company because natural gas is the fuel of the future. And I think that may be one of the first instances of anybody in the energy business saying natural gas is the fuel of the future. I mean, at that time, it was largely seen as a waste product by a lot of oil companies. Talk a little bit about what fracking has been able to do on the natural gas side and how that has kind of changed things.
Well, I think that, it's a fairly well-known story, but I can just give the highlights, which is, obviously our country went from a severely declining resource base. If you looked at the numbers through the kind of 80s and 90s, our natural gas production was on a steady decline. We were building LNG terminals starting in the 90s and early 2000s around the country to import natural gas. And then within, a very short period of time, less than 7 or 8 or 10 years, we're suddenly looking at these same LNG terminals to export gas around the world. I mean, there are some pretty remarkable numbers in terms of the economic benefit to the country in terms of trade deficit all the way to productivity and GDP. I think but I think at the same time, and this is something that I thought was really remarkable about my father, which is that he, any technology, I guess I'm talking to engineers and scientists and technologists, any technology has the consequences that either could be predicted or completely unpredictable or unintended. And I think what I really enjoyed in the last years of my father's life was watching him as he understood the kind of pushback against hydraulic fracturing, if you want to call that the process that was leading to this very dense development of oil and gas. He was surprised by it at first. He came to understand it over time. At the time, I was the president of Houston Advanced Research Center in the Woodlands, and we were, actually I'd transferred from president to being chairman, and we had a president who was the formerly with the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, a guy by the name of Bob Harris. And I remember having a conversation with my father, who was trained as a petroleum engineer at A&M, but also took the undergraduate geology program as well, so we kind of minored in geology. And we had the standard debate where he was saying, well, climate cycles change over time, and geologically, and you've seen that. And I was trying to get deep into the reading on climate science as best I could. And I was trying to kind of give him the argument that, well, no, there is this human influence. And he was really slow to pick that up and didn't want to. But then eventually he said to me, let me talk to Bob Harris. Well, Bob Harris, who was an atmospheric chemist and really deep into it. Maybe some people in the audience know Bob. But Bob sat with my father for an hour and a half one day, and about a week later I saw my father, and he's like, okay, I understand it now. And then the next bit was trying to convince him that more than 3% or so leakage in the natural gas system would have a severe climate impact on a level with coal. And again, that was one of those things that just took him a minute. But what I appreciate about him was kind of an understanding that you do things out of your goodwill, out of your best intentions, and then there's these unintended consequences. And before he died, he made sure it was clear to our family management of our foundation that natural gas program that looked at literally the difficult consequences of natural gas drilling would be part of our kind of legacy in the foundation. So anyway, it's an unusual sort of combination of total commitment to the natural gas industry, and yet sort of this transition as he understood the world's a complicated place.
Well, we were talking a little bit about this last night, but one of the things that people often say to me, they see my book and the first word of the subtitle is fracking, and they say, are you for or against it? And right. And it's not really that simple. I mean, I think, try to unravel that a little bit. I mean, well, there's, like anything, there's trade-offs. Right?
Yeah, I mean, I live in Aspen, Colorado, so, I have to wear a mask, and I'm the fracker. I've been involved in a lot of environmental organizations and initiatives over the years, and all those people, I'm the oil and gas guy. And when I was on the board at Devon Energy, I was the wild liberal environmentalist. So anyway, I've gotten kind of used to that. You know, I think the most interesting thing about the debate around hydraulic fracturing and the ultra dense drilling that comes along with it, you know, in these shale basins, it's really that there's communication misfires between sort of called industry and activists on the anti side of the ledger. And I think the misfire has to do with there's a lot of assumptions, and they're not entirely accurate among these sort of environmental activists in terms of what the consequences are. There's a lot of kind of, I think there's a public perception that fracking happens, you know, a few hundred feet below your water table, and that contamination of freshwater drinking is probably the single, you know, immediate impact. And because that is deemed by people in the industry, geologists, engineers, as being kind of far-fetched and not the real problem, they can dismiss this entire environmental community. But that would be a big mistake, because the consequences of, you know, this dense drilling are significant, whether it's the impact on the landscape, whether there is this potentially pervasive leakage of methane into groundwaters and potential migration. There are so many different consequences. And so what's happening is because sort of the language of the science and the engineering isn't shared by the two communities, it allows one to dismiss the other. And I think there should be a lot more of, you know, attempt, if you want to call it that, to kind of bridge the sort of the science and help both communities understand what the other concerns are.
What happens in terms of energy innovation and energy transition if, as some politicians have proposed, we just ban all fracking at this point?
That, I mean, first of all, it's confusing, because if you ban fracking, are you banning drilling?
Right,
let's go there later. You know, what are the consequences? I mean, I think just to get into the details, I think the bans would be on federal lands is the sort of most possible early type of action, and you know, a very large percentage of drilling is not on federal lands, but you know, nonetheless, some is. I think it would be tied up in litigation for years. It would be tied up in kind of a definition of what do you mean by banning fracking versus banning drilling. But you know, I just read an article this morning about this is going to sound a little off topic, but about Germany's rush to cancel or to decommission their nuclear facilities, with probably one of the most active populations in the world in terms of concern about climate change. And so their plan is to decommission both nuclear and coal. And there's also a large anti-fossil fuel sentiment in general. And so the reliance will be essentially on wind and solar, but there's also huge backlash against wind because it's disruptive of the landscape. And you know, solar can scale, but you know, the question is whether it can scale at the sort of, you know, global level. And so I think these are things that I had the great honor to be involved in a nonprofit with former Secretary of Energy Ernie Moniz, who I think is brilliant. He was Obama's Secretary of Energy in the second term. And he's just prepared two studies, one for the state of California and one for the country, in which he's kind of presenting a modification of the Green New Deal. And his biggest concern, and this is a guy who's totally dedicated to decarbonizing our energy infrastructure. I mean, that's his life's goal. And yet, his concern is the headlong rush into impossible mandates will backfire in terms of economics, in terms of availability, in terms of, you know, rolling brownouts and blackouts and so on. So I don't know how to predict what would happen in that context, but I think, you know, there's got to be sort of a sensible approach to how we transition over time.
And I think that was the point I was hoping to get you to, was that the natural gas reserves that have been unlocked with fracking have already had a tremendous impact in addressing climate change. We've switched a huge percentage of our generation, our electricity generation, from coal to natural gas. And without fracking as sort of this interim step, it's very hard to get to the next thing, right? Without that abundant natural gas supply.
Yep, absolutely. And then the next step will be to really understand the leakage in the natural gas system from the well bore all the way to the burner tip, to understand how that impacts. If for example, if carbon is one of your ultimate goals, how do you understand that system? And I think some of the studies actually led by some of the universities here, I know University of Texas was involved, but have identified that, I can't remember the exact number, but sort of like 2/3 of the volume of leakage in the natural gas system comes from less than 20% of the points along the way. And that's a really encouraging number when you look at how you identify and address those points. You could probably make big progress with relatively modest investment, is what it seems to indicate.
And the industry has some incentive to take that on because they're literally leaking money. I mean, well, not literally, but I mean, they're essentially leaking product that could sell. So.
And then you get into net present value and ROI type estimates of two different people who don't love to communicate, but nonetheless.
Let's go ahead and stop there. We got a little over 5 minutes left, and we can take some questions from the audience, or if nobody's awake enough to ask anything yet, we'll keep talking.
We'll ramble on.
Yeah, over here.
Okay, I'm awake. A couple of years ago, TAMEST did a study on environmental impacts of shale development on communities in Texas, which was done using the NRC procedures. It was a peer-reviewed study on 6 different aspects on the environmental impacts. And I'm just curious, to what extent have either of you been aware of that study, used it? It was a study purely on the science of hydraulic fracking, and it didn't make any statement as to should you do it or shouldn't you do it. It was just, what do we know scientifically, what don't we know, and what needs to be improved?
Sorry. So I don't know that I've read that study, but if I could catch up with you after the presentation, I would love a link to it. I've read pretty much everything I've been able to over the last several years about this whole the sort of what the science is saying, and so I can't comment except to say, in general, the impacts are real, they're significant. And I kind of go back to what I was saying earlier, which is that the perception of, if you were to rate in priority what the actual impacts are, I think there's still a lot of division among communities about what you would rank as the highest, but I'd love to see this work.
One of the things we're most proud about is that study has been quoted both by people in favor of fracking and people opposed to fracking.
If they all hate you equally.
and all you have to do is go to tamest.org and download a free PDF.
Yeah, I'll look it up. Thanks.
Anybody else?
If there are no other questions, I have another one.
Okay.
Okay, I hate to
Well,
monopolize your
let's
time, but
why not? You have 3 minutes and 1 second.
The government over the years has spent money doing research on hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling. To what extent did that help Mitchell, or if any?
Well, it absolutely did, and in a funny way, even though I guess I grew up with my father and I was on the board for all those years, and I was on Devon's board for 10 years, it's Loren Steffy who has the encyclopedic knowledge of which study and what date and so on. But the bottom line was that in the early days of Mitchell Energy attempting to do these massive hydraulic fraction, the Barnett Shale, there was money from the Department of Energy, and there's also money from what at the time was called the Gas Research Institute, GRI. They've now changed the name to the Gas Technology Institute, GTI. But some of those early wells were sort of three-way joint funded, but I mean, you might have a bit more detail.
No, that's right. The government was definitely brought in because of research that GRI had done in Appalachia. Mitchell Energy, reached out to them and brought them in, and the hope was that what they were able to do in Appalachia would translate into the Barnett Shale, and it didn't, because the geology was completely different. But the government was definitely involved in the early days. It became somewhat controversial. I think in one of his State of the Union addresses, Obama kind of took credit for fracking. He said, well, this came from government-funded research. And that was actually related to a comment that Dan Stewart, who had led the fracking project at Mitchell Energy, had made to a blog, to an environmental blog. And Dan's very good about trying to give credit to everybody who helped in the process. And he said, the government deserves credit for this. He didn't mean they deserved all the credit. And so when I talked to Dan after the State of the Union comment, he said, look, it boils down this way. The government could not have developed fracking without George Mitchell, but George Mitchell could have developed fracking without the government. So, I don't know that there has ever been an actual dollar amount put on how much Mitchell Energy itself invested in the project, but I actually talked with Dan about that, because there have been some numbers out there. The Economist at one point said it was $6 million. It's way more than that. There's no way that's right. Dan's estimate was, just on the research and the trial and error process, Mitchell Energy probably spent $500 million of its own money over the 17 years. And if you count land acquisition costs, that number's probably over $1 billion. So it was a very, very significant private investment that, definitely used public resources and public research, but really a lot of it was done on its own. So, all right, I guess we've got 6 seconds left. So that gives me just enough time to say we're going to wrap up. But if you're interested in the book, I have copies available for sale outside. Todd has agreed to sign them, as well as me. So if you have any interest, please stop by and see us after this. Thank you very much.
Thank you.